Alright, today we're going to be replacing this single piece crank on a BMX bike with a 3-piece crank set. When you go shopping for a 3-piece crank set, you'll have to find one that fits into the bottom bracket tube. You won't be able to use a sealed unit bottom bracket because this tube is just too big. If you look at the bikes with sealed unit bottom brackets, the tube is narrower where the bottom bracket fits in. So you have to find a 3-piece crank like this one here that still has the big ball bearings and the same adjustment system as the 1-piece crank, and then put it in. First you want to remove the pedals. And the pedals, if you look at where they're connected to the bike, there's a flat side here, so you just want to get a wrench in there. You need a fairly narrow flat wrench. I've got a specialized bicycle tool that works for that. All right, so the pedal that your left foot goes on, turn clockwise to loosen it. So clockwise is the way you would normally turn a screw to tighten it, but this one is what you'd call reverse threaded. So if you turn it clockwise, it comes undone. And then to get the bottom bracket out, you don't really need to remove the other pedal. We're going to use the other pedal on the new cranks, so I'm going to go ahead and remove it also. So the one that your right foot goes on, you turn it counterclockwise to unscrew it. So it's not reverse threaded. It's just the other side that was reverse threaded because the turning motion of the pedals would loosen it up if it weren't. All right, pedals off. I'm also going to loosen up the rear wheel. I'm going to loosen up the rear wheel and take the chain off as well so that it's not getting in the way. All right, so pop the back wheel loose to create some slack in the chain. And then just slide the chain right off so it won't be in our way. Now, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a lock nut on there like this, and then there's a piece behind the lock nut like this, and you screw them up against each other to create tension and keep the bearings in place. So what we're going to do is remove this lock nut first. Now this is another one that's reverse threaded, so you want to turn it clockwise, the way that you would turn something you were tightening to loosen it. So turn it clockwise, that comes right off. And then the piece that actually holds the bearings in, you can get a screwdriver in there and turn it clockwise also. There's a washer in between too, so we'll move the washer and turn this thing clockwise to bust it loose. Alright, so that comes off, and you just sort of weasel it out like that. Oh, you can see, if you look at this, you see that? Some of the balls have escaped from the cage, so it was time to replace it. This thing is pretty worn out. This kid's been riding a lot. And pull out the bearing cage. The ball just dropped out of this one as well. And there's a loose ball running around in here. Free ball. Alright, there we go. And then we clean that up and put the new one in. This thing also has plastic, at least on this side it had a plastic guide, so we may reuse that. Alright, let's take a quick look at this kit. So what you've got is an axle, and this end of the axle is set. So the bearing goes in there like that. That goes into the bike, and then on this side you've got your bearing, and then you've got your bearing race here that screws in on there. You've got your lock washer, your lock nut, and then on this end, on the crank end where the crank goes, you put your chain ring on, you put a washer on, and then you put a crank on top of that. The crank with the peg in it, you see there's a peg that goes into one of these holes, so you put the crank on there, Just this gives you a better view than while I'm doing it on the bike, I think. So you put all that together, put the other crank on the other side, stick some bolts in to cinch them down, and you're in business. So let's see what that looks like on the actual bike. All right, now we'll put it into the bike. All right, before I put the bearings in, I want to give them a good thick coating of grease all over them to keep them protected and make it run smooth. Make sure you get it all over the bearings and in between them as well, inside of the cage. And then I'm going to put a bunch of grease on the actual inner race here where they're going to run as well. So it's just super greasy. So that one's good and greasy. Put it in there. Do the same with the other one. So both bearings are covered with grease. There we go. So that's good and greasy. I'm even going to smear a little grease on the races here. More grease is better than less when we put this piece in. Then when we insert the axle, we're going to do it. The piece that has the race machined onto it goes in, stays on the chain side. Then the other piece with the adjuster goes on the non-chain side. That way it's easier to adjust once it's on. Alright, so now I'm going to put this plastic piece that came with it back in here to hopefully keep some of the dirt out. And then that's the piece that was already part of this bike. And then we'll put this bearing race in here. Again, we're turning it counterclockwise to tighten it. So just go against your instincts and turn it the opposite way that you think you should, and it'll tighten counterclockwise. And that's because if it was turned clockwise to tighten, then it would unscrew itself while you're pedaling. And same goes for the pedal on this side of the bike. And we just want to get to a point where it freewheels, but it doesn't rock back and forth. And the tuning a bottom bracket is a little tricky. It takes a little time to figure out how to do it right. So we just sort of loosen it until it rolls free, but doesn't rock back and forth. Like if you loosen it too much, then you can feel it rocking back and forth. So you want less than that. Just where it's able to turn freely, but not rock back and forth. Alright, so we've got our washer that's keyed. There's a little bump in there, goes into a little groove here that holds it onto the bike. And then you put your nut on there, turning it counterclockwise to tighten it. And this part is tricky. When you actually tighten this nut down, sometimes it'll put pressure on this back plate and tighten it up too tight on your bearings. So it's a real kind of fine-tuning dance you have to do where you're loosening the inner race so it wobbles a little bit, and then tighten the outer one down. Like I said, it's a kind of a tricky thing. It's also easier to do when you have a crank on the bike. Let me grab one of these cranks. So if we put the crank on here for leverage, hold on to it, and then turn against it to tighten the bottom bracket counterclockwise here. So this, you don't have to watch me do this over and over and over. You'll have to fine tune yours yourself. This is why people buy sealed bottom brackets, is because it's such a pain to tune these up properly. It's always either a little too loose or too tight. Alright, so after a little trial and error, we got the bottom bracket in there properly. So now we take the crank that doesn't have the chain ring on it, we put it onto the bike on the side where the gear isn't. Put that on, and then it's got a bolt that goes in from the side here to tighten it up. It also has a bolt that goes in here to cinch it down. So I'm going to tighten up this one first and then crank it down with that one. All right, so those are tight and that crank is on there. Ready to crank. All right, now on the chain side, we want to make sure we put the chain one the right direction and include all the correct parts. Also, if you're installing a new chain ring, which you probably will be, because the fixed crank one won't come off, if it is a different size chain ring than the one that you had before, you'll have to add links to your chain or subtract links to your chain, depending on if it's longer or shorter, or replace the chain altogether. So that's what we're going to have to do. That's where my son went. He went to the store to get a chain that fits while I do this. Let's see. All right, so we put a washer on, put the chain ring on. With this bike, there's not much clearance between the chain ring and the frame. Makes me a little nervous. And then we put the crank on so that it forms a flat line, just the opposite of the other crank. Making sure that the little peg on the back of the crank goes through one of these rings on the chain ring. And then we'll just do the same as we did on the other side. Crank it down this way. Make sure that we're making the chain ring good and tight, keeping it from moving, and then clamp it down in the middle with this one. Ta-da! So that spins. And that's all there is to that. So he has now more of a legit look than he did before. He's got actual three-piece looking cranks. Now some folks will say that gear is way too big for BMX bikes. All the cool guys have a small gear, so that's probably going to be our next step. Actually, I think our next step will be just to buy him a different bike, but don't tell him that. Alright, so that's it. The crank is on there. Spinning around. I just need to clean the grease off of it to make it pretty. Put our new chain on and then we're good to go. So that has more of a serious look, and it's sturdier than the single piece cranks. Looks pretty cool too. We painted it white to match the frame, and he's going to see if he can find a white chain as well. Alright, now it's time to put the pedals on. And what I've discovered is that the old pedals have a different sized thread than the new cranks. So my old pedals won't go in. They're the wrong size. So we have to use different pedals. Unfortunately, I had some of these lying around, so we're just gonna put these bigger, fatter old pedals in. So the one on the chain side goes in clockwise, and the one on the other side goes in counterclockwise. Oh, hey, telephone. That's probably the kid calling from the bike shop asking about the chain. All right, there we go, finished product. Everything's together. I had to add 2 links to the chain, and the old pedals wouldn't fit, but other than that, it's pretty smooth. So I hope that helps you decide if you want to do it and teach you how to put a 3-piece bottom bracket in.